We've been missing you. Do you want to find the witch friends you've been missing? Do you want to participate in these conversations live? And do you want to support the work of recovering a true history of feminist ideas about magic? Do you want to hang out? Do you want an invite to Zoom together with Amy and myself every new moon, along with our hilarious, diverse, wise, queer, creative, anti-racist, science, and awe-loving coven? You must join the Missing Witches Patreon. It's pay what you can, and we can't wait to meet you there. Patreon.com/missingwitches.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch.
Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch.
You must be a witch.
I'm going to take a deep breath and ground myself in my snowy lake here, and my excitement at our guest and at all of you, whether you are here with us in this moment or listening down the lines. Welcome, witches. Welcome, practitioners of all stripes. Welcome, waves of all bodies and listeners and lichen. We're so honored and excited to get to come together in a space where we take the anger and magic seriously, and the awe and the ecology of it all. And I will start with my introduction to this incredible writer whose words have been coming to me like a big, exciting wave across the distance by telling a little bit of a story I read in a couple places or heard versions of Sophie Strand telling a story about an encounter with magic, being in an unsafe space, and then a magical kind of moment, someone appearing and handing her a strange golden object and being able to escape. And in that moment, she said, I tell you this story of magic with the hope that you believe me, that I offer you this and hope it doesn't get killed by offering it, And so as my introduction to all of us, this is a circle, whether for the kid inside of you or the crone, to hear that you are believed. So welcome, electrifying writer. How are you? Where are you? Tell us a little bit we should know about you today.
Well, thank you for that very generous intro. I'm in the Hudson Valley. I'm right at the confluence of the Rondout Creek and the Hudson River. And so I'm kind of in the city, kind of in a village, mostly next to the herons and the eagles and the water, and that lymphatic pulse where two bodies of water meet. How am I today? I am melted. I am the compost heap in its most rotted phase, but I'm trying to really enjoy and be open to the surprising fertility of that experience. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, my body is in revolt today. I don't feel great today, to be honest. I sort of sparked when you said you're at this lymphatic confluence. It feels like my lymphatic system has been in revolt today, and my bones are achy. And yeah, just to be honest about where my body is at, I feel like a crumbly compost heap with spikes sticking up through it and a hard chair.
Well, we're both there, and it's honestly, it's really nice to have someone offer such a sober and serious answer to that question. I'm there too. Yeah, I don't even know,
Yeah,
it's a little bit of a melted day, but I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here and for being honest about that. I think a heartbreaking amount of our listeners can relate to that feeling in our bodies. I don't know exactly what it is about chronic illness and chronic pain in this time in our world.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it's a resonance with the pain of the earth, and that there's a kind of mirroring that happens, especially, for people who are really aware of ecology and where they live. They can oftentimes see that their wound is actually the shape of the wound in the land, but that doesn't make it fun. Yeah.
No, it doesn't make it fun. How do you think about healing that stuff? I mean, There's sort of this desire, I think, to think that like as we heal ourselves, we heal the world. And I think that's beautiful and appealing and also sort of simplistic, frustrating, you know. I value self-care, but I don't think self-care on its own is activism.
Yeah, I actually think that I've been a little allergic to the word healing lately because it doesn't necessarily map onto my experience. You know, I have an incurable illness. It won't heal. I can salvage it. You know, a friend of mine who has the same condition said, health isn't how well your body's doing, it's the amount of joy you feel in your life. And that felt much more nourishing than this idea of being fixed when there isn't a fix, when I don't, you know, when the dominant narrative is the narrative of progress, the arrow of time, social evolution, and I don't really fit into that. So healing for me has always been almost a weaponized term. It's supposed to turn us into atomized individuals who are responsible for our health, rather than being fixes where oppression sediments. You know, illness is not necessarily an individual responsibility. It's just showing that you are the capture of oppression and sites of pain that are more than just you. So to expect a human being to solve the problem that is caused by entangled, complicated systems of oppression that, you know, span time, span countries, it seems like something to do to paralyze you. So healing for me has become a very complicated term. I want to thrive. I want to be ecstatic. I want to be complicated. I want to be prickly. I want to live each, you know, I think of Audre Lorde's diary when she was dealing with cancer that wasn't going to be cured, being like, I want to go out like a meteor. I want to go out like a meteor. I don't want to heal. I don't know if healing is available, but I want to be very bright and shiny and complicated.
Yes, fuck. Can you apply that to your thinking about masculinities? I know you have a forthcoming book entitled The Flowering Wand, Lunar Kings, Lycanized Lovers, Trans-Species Magicians, Rhizomatic Harpists Heal the Masculine, which is a badass title, and I want to talk about all the bits of it. But for my own context, I have family members who work at the intersection of masculinities and suicide rates because of you know, repeated encounters with that. And acknowledging the deep truth in what you just said about healing, how do we embrace the masculine or bring it into the compost heap of all of this, the pain that the feminine has been feeling or something?
First, I'll say that I don't think there's any such thing as a biological male or a biological female. And if you actually look at nature, queerness is ubiquitous and intersects and all sorts of strange, amazing, troubling amalgamations. I mean, lichen, which is the fusion of, you know, an algae and a fungi and then a yeast and then a bacteria. Like, I'm much more interested in that than any kind of determinism. But culturally, masculine and feminine are so ingrained that it's probably important to massage them. And the thing that's worried me is that masculinity has been conflated with patriarchy and with capitalist patriarchy, but it's not the same thing. And it's been at the detriment to men who are trying to tell a new story, but aren't given a story. There's no alternative offered. The issue, I think, has been, I've been thinking a lot of capitalism and patriarchy as being kind of like narrative dysbiosis, which is when you take too many antibiotics and you kill off all your gut biome, there's too much open real estate so that a pathogen can take over and bloom, like a yeast or something really terrible. And the issue is if you take fungicides to kill the yeast, it just creates the same problem again and again and again. And the idea of cleaning out your gut, of trying to kill off the pathogen, doesn't repopulate the gut with healthy biodiversity. So the way I've been thinking about tackling patriarchal capitalism as being a bad story, as being a monologuing pathogen, has been, how do I overwhelm it with a probiotic of other stories? How can I go backwards and look at and see if there are older, more healthier modes of the masculine in mythology, fairy tales, folk tales, herbal lore? And how can I compost them with modern science and modern philosophy and storytelling? So what I'm really looking for is a polyphony, like discordant, sometimes continuous, sometimes melodious, sometimes absolutely opposed songs that weave together to create something very complex and thus like a resilient ecosystem, very resilient to climate change and to pressure and to illness.
Can you give us some examples from your book of essays? Especially, I want to talk about trans species magicians.
Oh, that's my favorite example. Not my favorite, one of my favorite. So I think a great example is the mythological figure of Merlin, who predates the Arthurian myths and may have actually even been a bardic historical figure who then gets combined with all these different figures to create, the wizard Merlin of the Arthurian myths. Geoffrey of Monmouth, this kind of like fictional, he was a historian, but he was really a storyteller. He actually combined all these different figures to create Merlin. But the figure of Merlin is really interesting in that he's a hedge dweller. He's interstitial, he's mycelial, he's that connective tissue rather than any kind of discrete node of intelligence. And he goes into the woods. So he'll come and give kings advice or prophecy and help kings navigate certain kinds of dilemmas or war-like situations. But then he'll go mad because he's in civilization too long and the violence drives him mad, and he goes back to the forest. He oftentimes turns into a stag, he runs with pigs, he wears antlers, and he oscillates between the world of men and the more than human world. And in fact, in order to instruct kings, instruct men on how to be a man, he doesn't draw on the stories of men, he draws on the stories of hawks and salmon and streams and rivers. This goes all the way back to the Mabinogion and the oldest Welsh annals, where we have that story that says, I was a loaf of bread, I was a kernel of wheat, this oldest poem that's attributed to Taliesin and Merlin, which is he teaches you how to be a man by teaching you how to be something else, how to be a variety of different beings, an ecosystem rather than an individual. And so I think trans-species magicians really, it shows you, what does it mean? Like transness is about living between, letting yourself become rather than be this like solid, discrete, legible object. You're constantly in flow. And I think it's also trans species. So I think of Merlin as being a very trans figure in every sense of the word, always moving, always flexible, always adaptive.
I love that, especially in the way of imagining. I think that just resonates a lot with my own experience of civilization. I like to go into the world and, like this weekend, see a drag show and see all my coven, my women, and then like it's all too much and I need to go be a stag or a slug for a little bit or curl up with my kid like a fox or something. Can you, so you have another book coming out, eco-feminist historical fiction reimagining of the Gospels called The Madonna Secret. I want to talk about that too, like the why and how of reimagining Gospels and ecofeminism.
Well, I think ecofeminism is kind of like a catchword that like catches the right audience. But honestly, if you're a feminist, you should be an ecofeminist. If you're an eco-activist, you should also be a feminist. The two are inextricable. So it does feel like a little bit of a simplistic term or like a fake term. A little too superficial. For me, I was raised by an ex-Buddhist monk and kind of a pagan witch mother, and then also by a Israeli Jewish family that my family married into. So I had a lot of, and my parents studied and wrote about religion and spirituality. So I was like raised by monks and rabbis and nuns, theologians and philosophers. And I had a very intimate understanding early on that there are really helpful parts of spirituality and then there are really toxic parts of them. And a question I'd always had is, how does someone who seems like a nature-based storyteller who's focused on inviting everyone to the table get turned into like the symbol of oppression and genocide and ecocide? Like what happens with Christianity in particular that it gets so co-opted by colonialism, by imperialism, by sexism and racism and misogyny? Like what goes wrong? And so, I studied with one of the premier scholars of biblical studies in college, and really, and I've been reading stuff my whole life, very interested in goddess culture, the movement from from pantheism to monotheism. And eventually I thought, no one's ever really done a really historical look at what happens when a Galilean magician, storyteller, healer gets murdered by an imperial government. early on in his teachings. And then his
Mhm.
teachings get deracinated from the ecology and the social context where they were grown, translated into the language of the oppressors that assassinated him, and then disseminated to a bunch of different countries as if it could possibly be transplanted. I think of Jesus as being a deracinated figure. A great example is his parable of the mustard seed seems kind of cute to us in in Oklahoma, theater church. That's just going to kind of come off as kind of like a riddle. But the truth is that the kingdom is like a mustard seed to a Galilean farmer would have been an extremely vegetal, anarchic thing to say. Mustard seeds were an invasive species. They took over your fields. They destroyed your crops. It was almost anti-agricultural. So the kingdom of God is here, and it's that weed that you hate that destroys your crops. So Jesus is a much more radical figure than we even know. So I wanted to write a book, but the book is from Mary Magdalene's point of view. So I wanted to also write it from a female Jewish perspective, like really also reroute the fact that Jesus was a Jew who was attempting to reform Judaism. He wasn't creating Christianity. So I was really thinking about, like, how do I create texture? How do I people this place? How do I create a sensory scaffolding that makes this come alive in a way that we don't get when we're reading the texts of the oppressors?
You talk about interstitial thinking too. We've interviewed a bunch of different writers and thinkers recently who just sort of on their own brought up an idea of channeled work, of feeling like work is coming through them. Yeah, is there a relationship there, do you think, between interstitial thinking, moving along sort of mycelial lines, being inspired or taken up by the fairies, as you've recently written about, around us, and an idea of channeled work in this sort of other language?
Yeah, I mean, I always want to trouble this idea that channeling is a fun experience. But I do think that it is our responsibility right now to decenter human narratives and to become a mouth for those species that are going extinct, those species whose stories need to be centered. The thing I always think about is the fungi, the Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, that takes over carpenter ants and coordinates their behaviors to walk up these stems of plants and then bite into the vein underneath this leaf and sporulate from their heads. So the ant, the biologist Merlin Sheldrake writes in his book that by the end, it's just a fungus wearing an ant costume. And that's a pretty horrifying experience for the ant, perhaps, but maybe that's what we're required to do. I wrote an essay about that using Garcia Lorca's idea of the duende, which is like, this is not the muse. This is not the fetishized, beautiful inspiration. This is dancing in the wound with the devil. This is like knowing that making art is an emergency, and perhaps your aliveness in your survival is not the most important part of it. So personally, I have a genetic connective tissue disease. And I found this out after I had loved fungi and underground mycorrhizal systems for many years, which are the connective tissue of the soil. And for me, it felt like this pivot point where I could become very solipsistic and feel very bad about myself, or I could see how I could become a channel for something else that perhaps understood me. So how can we become a channel for another species, knowing that perhaps it won't be pleasurable, or it won't be legible. We won't be able to understand what it is. All we'll know is that, like the carpenter ant, we are climbing up that piece of grass. We are sporulating something we're not totally in control of. And so interstitial thinking is that mycelial thinking. It's like, also, how can you let your nuclei flow through the hyphal networks, that filamentous fabric that holds the soil and ecosystems together? How can you let yourself travel between different sensory experiences so that when you're speaking, you're not just speaking from a human perspective? Your mycorrhizal system is flowing into a tree, into an orchid, into a ghost pipe, into a plain of grasses. Yeah. So it shows that the most fertile spots are often between mythic gradients and between opposing ideas, rather than in these simplistic and fictional idea of binaries.
Since we're playing with some kind of classic witch language that we like to play with and problematize and explore around, what about potions? Let's talk about health, like bringing, maybe it's different from healing, but bringing ourselves to like a balanced state by the things we take in, or sort of sacralizing or creating rituals around food or drink or medicine or relationships with medicine. I know you have a complicated relationship with medicine and health. You called it a tricky dance partner, which I love.
Well, I wrote a piece about how the word poison comes from the word potion, and how potion is this word for something very intense. And that in fact, the idea of poison is a relatively modern idea that's more reflective of our inability to dose anything. We always do things in extremes.
Right.
Any substance, when not taken seriously, when not understood as being sacred and animate and different than you, can be used ineffectively, even if it's a medicine. So for me, I kind of think of everything as being pharmakon, which is that older Greek term for something that can be either a poison or a potion or a medicine. And how can I be incredibly respectful of my food and of my medicines, and to understand that maybe the model of being always in need of a medicine isn't what I should be thinking about. I should reframe it and say, how can I be a medicine? We're so extractive. We're always, it's part of why psychedelic culture for me feels a little problematic right now, which it's like, I just need a heroic dose to have my eco-awakening and then I will act better. It's like, how can you be a medicine? Where in the landscape needs you? How could you act medicinal? Why do you always need to be taking and eating and consuming? I don't land on any solid answer about what medicine is to me or what a potion is to me. I just know that I have to be in interrogative relationship with the things that constitute me. I am made, my molecules are built by the microbiome I breathe in, by the food that I eat that's grown in the soil around here, that, I'm intimately metabolically looping with my landscape. I'm not different than my landscape. I mean, I am different, but I am entangled with it. So I think landscape is medicinal, and I also have to learn how to be medicinal to it.
I want to invite Ravi or Cassandra. Ravi in particular, in one of our previous coven circles, talked about identification of they, them as coming from an understanding of the many microbiome they carry with them.
Yeah, I'm cooking, so just give me a second while I check on my cooking.
Go for it. That's a perfect thing to be doing while we talk about this.
Like they said, I chose the they, them pronouns not just for, gender reflection, but also I'm in healthcare, and I remember learning about the microbiome and listening to some really cool information about, you have more bacterial DNA than you do human DNA inside your body. And I was like, oh, that's it. I mean, we're holobionts,
Exactly.
we're not just one thing. And this is a fantastic way to dissolve these like boundaries and borders and things that are getting in the way of connection and getting in the way of living in that reciprocity.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. And yeah, I sometimes say to people like they, them is so much more accurate than he or she. We have 10 times as many bacterial cells in our body than we do human cells. And our very cells are the product of anarchic symbiogenetic fusion of organelles. Like we are the product of like anarchic queer lovemaking. That's kind of how I try and frame it. But I also think it's important to honor the differences that prick and sustain conversation, and those gradients, where the river actually flows from the mountaintop down to the valley and carves a actual vein into the stone, and that we are all connected, but not everything is connected to everything. And, if your gut tissue breaks down and all of those bacteria get out, it'll kill you. So it's those slight differences that create a complicated holobiont that are important to also honor. That, I sometimes am worried about spirituality's movement towards a kind of homogenizing universalism, that everything is the same. And I always want to say, it's the differences between us that create us, that we have ecosystems inside of us that never touch, but create us. It's a very beautiful idea. I also sometimes think like, yes, so I have so many different, like I have fungi on my skin, I have bacteria in my liver. I mean, I'm created by all of these different things. I wonder what I'm creating. And so I sometimes also like to think about like, what am I minuscule in? So holarchy is this idea of like nested systems. This seems like such an important thing to to start playing with.
Yeah, I appreciate that specificity. I worry sometimes when I see, or not worry, but I question when I see the broad use of fungi as a metaphor with the way that we can metaphorize everything. It sort of reminds me of like, early postmodernism or whatever, when everything was quantum physics and it was just like, it was the metaphor for everything. It loses its realness.
And we also, I think the thing that's interesting is we don't know that much about fungi.
Right.
They're the neglected mega science. So we can make metaphors from them, but we also don't quite know enough about them to make metaphors. And I think that there's a very utilitarian, almost like teleological relationship to them. Like, this is what they do for us. This is how they function. This is why they're useful, which is interesting and important. But I also think that they're probably spectacular and amazing on their own, and that it's important to just let them be and to also ask them more questions. So with every species that I'm thinking about and metaphorizing, I'm also trying to keep that open interrogative channel where I'm letting it surprise me.
Cassandra, can I invite you if you want to respond to anything? I know you're here, your lovely energy's here.
I did very briefly want to say just how beautifully all of these sessions are linking together. So as I've been taking note, you had mentioned, Sophie, like dancing in the wound. It just brought me back to when we were, sorry, let me look at my notes here just very briefly. When we were talking to Marcelite, and she was mentioning communicating with like your problematic ancestors as a way of their healing. And it's all just like slowly meshing and melding into each conversation. And
thanks for that. I think that connection to, so we recently interviewed a PhD candidate at Emory who's writing about the Black Witch, and she's a hereditary Black witch and fucking badass and awesome writer and thinker. And we both got really emotional at one point thinking about, she was sharing from interviews she'd had with different practitioners, trying to understand this. She's like, healing, I don't know if I get it. What is that really, And the story she told was giving a problematic ancestor, an ancestor who caused pain, an opportunity to help you in ritual work, to call them in and say, I need your help now. We're going to do this together. Freeze them in a way. And that's what they mean by healing the 7 generations of the past in hoodoo and in other traditions. I wanted to ask you about this idea that when I read it from you, like landed in my belly, and we read it out loud in another coven circle, your piece about the body as an ancestor. Can you talk out loud with us about that idea?
Yeah, I do think there's I think that there's a great need for lineage healing, perhaps, for people to look back and see where they're coming from, what's inside their cells, what trauma has been passed down. But there's also something a little anthropocentric about it, and also a little bounded, which is it's not a lineage, it's an intertangled relationship. It's a web with multiple doors of entry in a very kind of rhizomatic way, to misuse that metaphor. But and it creates this false agential cut between us and other species, when the truth is that, the farther you go back, the more we're all involved in each other's shit. And, you can look at anything and realize that it's your ancestor. And in fact, your body is a composite of ancestors. Your molecules have constituted past ancestors of yours that are now in your body. That, the fact that we know how to have placentas, that we create new beings that we then become an ancestor for, we learned from viruses, that our ability to be an ancestor is viral. And I think that it's sometimes there's such an onus on us to do certain kinds of ritual work and to follow the rules. And that sometimes seems like a very rearticulation of the patriarchal, hierarchical situations we're trying to escape, which is, and it's also very intellectual, but how can we drop into our bodies and realize that every breath we take is connecting us, it is honoring our ancestors, that every time we eat something and our microbiome works, we are honoring all of the bacterial legacies that constitute us. And I think it was a way of making the body sacred and realizing that the very practical things that the bodies the body does ties us into all of our more than human ancestors. And something I like offer to people who've asked me about this is, you can find any being that you love, any mountain, any salamander, any type of grass. And if you work hard enough, you can create that connective tissue to understand the line that draws you back to it scientifically. You can do it poetically, you can do it spiritually, but you can also scientifically trace those steps that lead you back to that blade of grass.
Can you talk more about that and maybe go back to, and I'm like excited to know more about this, that we learned our ability to grow a placenta from a virus?
Okay, I'm going to try and say this one word. It's difficult. I'm probably going to stumble on it. I use so many words that I can't pronounce in my writing. Okay.
I love that.
Your body is an ancestor. The locust leaves lie like golden scales across the stones. I imagined last night a honey-colored snake winding along the path parallel to the river, rubbing off the skin of the past year. A light rain fills the air, hung on wind, refusing to fall, swept forever sideways, as if guided by another gravity. It is almost Samhain, a time when some believe that the dead are closest, although ancestral celebrations punctuate the entire calendrical year, each tailored to different ecosystems and practices. The dead, outside of our idea of linear time, paradoxically mark the passing of time. How do we honor our ancestors? What are the rituals and the spells necessary to mark this time? I want to offer that although rituals are powerful and spells can summon the unexpected, there is no need of special instruction or initiation. All you need is your hands, your eyes, and the constant infinity loop drawn between your lungs and the churning, sporulated air of the entire world. You do not need to build an ancestor altar. You do not need to trace your bloodline back 10 generations. Ancestry isn't a lineage, it's a non-linear tangle of animacy with multiple points of entry. For me, ancestry extends beyond the human. It is rhizomatic rooting into different species and deep time. Your body is an ancestor. Your body is an altar to your ancestors. Every one of your cells holds an ancient and anarchic love story. Around 2.7 billion years ago, free-living prokaryotes melted into one another to form the mitochondria and organelles of the cells that build our bodies today. All you need to do to honor your ancestors is to roll up like a pill bug into the innate shape of safety, the fetal position. The curl of your body then is an altar not just to the womb that grew you, but to the retroviruses that 200 million years ago taught mammals how to develop the protein syncytin that creates the syncytophotoblast, a layer of the placenta. Breathe in slowly, knowing that your breath loops you into the biome of your ecosystem. Every 7 to 10 years, your cells will have turned over, rearticulated by your inhales and exhales, your appetites and proclivity for certain flavors. If you live in a valley, chances are the ancient glacial moraine, the fossils crushed underfoot, the spores from grandmotherly honey fungi have all entered into and rebuilt the very molecular makeup of your bones, your lungs, and even your eyes. Even your lungfuls of exhaust churn you into an altar for the Mesozoic ferns pressurized into the fossil fuels you are threaded through with fossils. Your microbiome is an ode to bacterial legacies you would not be able to trace with birth certificates and blood lineages. You are the ongoingness of the dead, the alembic where they are given breath again. Every decision, every idea, every poem you breathe and live is a resurrection of elements that date back to the birth of this universe itself. Today, I realize that due to the miracle of metabolic recycling, it is even possible that my body somehow holds the cells of my great-great-grandmother, or your great-great-grandmother, or that I am built from carbon that once intimately orchestrated the flight of a hummingbird or a pterodactyl. Your body is an ecosystem of ancestors, an outcome born not of a single human thread, but a web of relations that ripples outwards into the intimate ocean of deep time. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Thanks for writing that and for sharing it. That was things that I needed to hear.
Thank you for letting me read it and for saying that.
Yeah, I feel emotional whenever I read that piece and when I think about it. And do you feel like you are at a place with your writing where all this stuff is rushing out of you? It feels like, following you on Instagram, for example, or places, it feels like there are these big waves of ideas and words that are coming, and you're met with a big wave of response almost every time. Does this feel like a really charged time for you, or does it feel like not? I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know what's happening to me. And the last 2 years have been really, really, really difficult. My engagement broke down. I had a miscarriage. My partner left me, had a miscarriage, and my health melted and the pandemic began. And then I'd written this long novel that everyone had told me was going to be sold really quickly. I got an agent immediately, and it was rejected 27 times. And my doctors were not feeling great about my health. And maybe this past March, I thought, if I'm going to die, if I'm never going to get published, never get a publishing deal, I better just write about the things that I would want to share, even if I don't live to see them make it. My big thing is like, make good soil. Like, maybe I'm not going to be the person who sees these ideas sprout, but I should at least try and make some good soil. And I was really, really surprised when I started to post this stuff online. I used to do the very traditional route of, getting things published by a magazine, going all the traditional ways. And I thought, if I'm going to die, who cares? Who gives a fuck? I'd rather just have a relationship with readers. And, within like a week, I had 3,000 new readers. So that was really intense. I've been very inspired by Amanda Palmer, who her whole idea is, don't create superficial readership, connect with each reader. So I've been trying to respond to every single message I get. And at this point, I get hundreds of messages a day. So I'm going to have to restructure this. But it's kept me alive. It got me a book deal. I mean, within a month of publishing stuff online, I had a publisher approach me and buy both my books. And then I wrote another book.
Right.
So it was like that side door. It was like you thought you were only given two options, but the window was open. That being said, I still don't know. I mean, I feel like this writing has kept me alive, but I'm so exhausted. Yeah. I'm in health crisis right now. I don't know what the next steps are. And I can see that I'll just probably write till burnout or until something shifts. But the relationships that have been created to other people and other thinkers and have made me feel life-sustainingly less alone. So that has been, I'm extremely grateful for that. Yeah. Thank you for asking.
That's fucking wild to hear, because you can kind of feel that pulsing in the background of these posts, these stories that you're sharing. I know that there are so many people listening to this who are just like brimming on the edge of their seats and on the edge of tears with care for you and with thanks for your story, and who've connected with you and who will connect with you. I just want to sort of speak to that moment, whatever kind of prayer we believe in, especially if it's just, speaking to the universe, being allowed to talk out loud to the universe, that we are sending so much health to you and to each other. And a reminder that you are worthy of deep breaths and relaxing moments and all our love and care. You don't have to output until you collapse.
I know, every time my mom is like, are you going to stop? Are you going to stop researching and reading? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to stop. And then I'm like, actually,
just one more thing real quick. Yeah.
But thank you for that. And I think that the fallow moments are so important. Mm-hmm. When it looks like nothing, the mushrooms all pop up overnight, but they're working on it for years below ground.
Right.
And so right now I'm a lot of mushrooms and I'm spoiling like crazy, but yeah, to tell the truth, this is like super transparent. I don't think I've ever said this. Given my health and my trauma history, and given the total meltdown of my last relationship, I've always thought like I would need to have like an extremely odd partner. It would like really have to be a very weird person. And they'd have to really, given the instability of my body, it would have to not be the way the way they'd find me wouldn't be like visual, wouldn't be through dating apps. It would have to be about my ideas. So there's also a part of me that's like, if I'm ever going to have a partner again, I better spoil it and hope that they like see it and find me. So yeah, that's my little like weird love prayer.
I relate to that, that they're love notes. They're all love notes. I get that. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, this project is endless love notes. I mean, I found my partners. I found my way back to a person that could be in a relationship with my partner by being like just sort of totally destroyed and then relentlessly honest. But this project continues to be a project of love notes for me, both writing the book and doing these interviews of like a queer diversity of love that I need. I need all the odd kin. I don't feel sufficiently supported by one partner. He's rad, but yeah, I need all you guys. Ravi, I see your face again. Yeah, go for it, love.
Yeah, I wanted to tie it a little back to the beginning of the episode where you had said that self-care isn't really like great activism because it's gotten co-opted by, people that are selling it back to you in a capitalized way. And I think that one of our great challenges is to take it back. And my hypothesis around all of this, well, a lot of these things, is whenever you do put your best healed self out into the world, then the systems dissolve because you're taking yourself out of play to keep those harmful systems in place. So when you take the time or the fallow time or anything that you need, that kind of like, I guess you could call it self-care, but it's like it's revolutionary in its way of growing into the cracks of something that is that's being oppressive and bursting it open.
Well, I just wanted to say that I didn't say self-care was wrong. I said healing. The word healing. No. But I want to say, I think that it's every time you make yourself orgasm, you make a good cup of coffee, you let your to-do list dissolve is radical. And I really believe what Adrienne Marie Brown writes about, which is like, make the revolution pleasurable. The big person I write about and pray to is Dionysus. Like he gets co-opted and he's submitted to a smear campaign by the Romans because he's so revolutionary. That his other name was Liber for liberation. And he inspired Spartacus and the revolt of the witch Bacula Ania, and all of these different revolts against the Roman Empire. And for me, Dionysus is invasive species and fermentation and vines and ivy and leopards and women getting to embody their full vegetal power. And so for me, self-care is Dionysian. It's saying like, what is going to be the sexiest, most chaotic experience today? The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Right. So self-care is not a master's tool. So yes, I think live in the cracks, take care of yourself in a radical, sexy, wild, sometimes illegible way, culturally illegible way. Yeah. I
think you're immediately on the heart of the issue, which is like how these things have been sold to us in a way for us to just keep propping up the same harmful systems.
Yeah, I think of self-care as the withdraw part of a wave. It's inadequate on its own as activism. It's a withdraw for care and then a rushing forward with a community of care. And I want to be part of both of those things and not be sold either of them.
I love that. That's perfect little.
That's a great metaphor.
Thanks. It's in my book. I want to finish. I never want to finish, But I want to close the container of this particular moment, knowing that we will spiral outward into future configurations of love and support and oddkin for each other. We're claiming you as oddkin, Sophie.
Yay.
I do want to invite you. Is there a ritual that you make use of, an incantation, a way of thinking, a magical practice, something you can share with listeners? And in this particular sense, something that maybe we can share as a way of that radical, pleasurable self-care, or supporting that wave of coming back to each other.
I have two things. So I'm not going to offer one, I'm going to offer two. One, the first one is very somatic and very real, which is, our hands have thousands of mechanoreceptors, and they're so much more sensitive and tied to our brain and to our emotions than we give them credit. And they're also, life is haptic. A photon hits your eyes. Seeing is actually touch. Smell is touch. It's a molecule plugging in and creating a cascade of neurons that hit your brain. And so our hands are our entry point into a kind of ecological embodiment. So I like the practice created by Betty Martin, the somatic therapist, called Pleasure in the Hands, where you take an object. But for me, that object has to be outside. It has to be a stone, a handful of dirt, maybe a stick, a mushroom, a branch, maybe just like a huge boulder that you're touching, and touch it slowly. Feel it touching you. Touch it with one hand and then the other. Close your eyes so that you damp down those other senses and start to wake up your hands with that object and come into relationship with it. And then slow down how slow you're touching it. And you will realize suddenly that there's so much more available in your hands, and there's so much more touching you in the world. The world is always reaching back. So that touch practice, Pleasure in the Hands, which you can look up online, it feels to me to be so rich. I mean, you could do it every day and have a different experience. People often cry when they do it. It's unexpected. And then a smaller, less somatic, but equally important practice that I really always offer is every morning I wake up and I summon by name, not necessarily taxonomical or colonial, not Linnaean, whatever name feels intimate and cozy and correct. Every being, fungal, plant, geological, indigenous population that I know in a 20-mile radius, and I call them into counsel. I call them in to witness my decisions so that I understand every decision I make is relational throughout my day. So I create my ecosystem around me in the morning. I remind myself of it.
Well, those are wildly powerful. So thank you. And thank you for this enormous output and labor and connection and channeling that you're doing. If you want one more face to imagine when you choose to share those things, please picture mine. I'm often in tears by what you share and inspired to go back to my own writing. It's really helpful. So thanks. Before I get too weepy, I will say thank you to all of you being here, here in this moment and here in all the future moments encountering with this strange little piece of audio we will put out into the world. That's all for me. Thanks, everybody. Blessed fucking be.
Thank you. I mean, this has been, you asked about medicine earlier. This has been medicine to me that has been so correctly attuned to today. Thank you.
Phew. That's all we're looking for. Just don't want to fuck up your day.
You must be a witch.
The Missing Witches podcast is brought to you by the Missing Witches Coven. Join us right now on patreon.com/missingwitches. Blessed fucking be.